Teal Swan is a YouTuber and spiritual teacher.
Whenever you're in any type of a situation or a setup or a relationship, could be even a job, you want to ask yourself, what am I giving up for the sake of this thing?
We chat about what childhood experiences lead to creating narcissism, what a soul retrieval is and how you can do it, and if claims of remote viewing, ESP, and seeing auras are legitimate. I wanted to start with a video that I watched. It was Tony Robbins talking to Theo Von. You may not have seen the podcast, but this represents a way of being that I'd become very familiar with. Theo is opening up about low self-worth, and Tony is helping him to reframe and address those feelings in a way that is one line that he says, those feelings are not your friend. We don't want to, get close to those. Essentially, we want to have someone else steering. And I've had a tremendous amount of value in my life from reframing, denying, and avoiding certain feelings. And recently, via your stuff and a lot of other people, I've taken almost the opposite approach and started moving towards low self-worth, saying, yes, tell me your story. I'm not trying to get away from you. And so I'm curious, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It seems like a huge part of my life got value from the reframe. So when is it appropriate to change a feeling, if ever? And when is it appropriate to sink in, move towards, open up, that sort of thing?
Even in the premise of this question is an attitude that the emotion, the negative emotion, is somehow against improvement. And that is not the case. So the best case scenario is to treat this like a 1-2 step. Whenever you've got like a painful emotion that's arising, there's information that's carried within that emotion, and often aspects of self that very deeply need to be touched into. So let's say that you do that. It's an assumption and a projection that when you do that, the emotion will only intensify and get worse. I think that the law of attraction communities have made this the worst, if you want my honest truth, because it's this attitude that whatever you give your attention to becomes more. And this is not actually how emotions work, most especially when you're entering into them with the vibrational frequency of intention of caretaking an emotion or an intention of learning from something. Just the free will that comes with that conscious choice is changing your entire relationship to that emotion and is therefore acting as an elixir towards the emotion itself. People don't get stuck in emotions unless they're resisting that emotion. Emotions are very water-like. Some of them have more grip than others, but if you spend a lot of time with an emotion, exposing it to the light of consciousness, it doesn't stay like it is.
Mm-hmm.
So what will happen?
Why would it appear, for instance, for someone like a Theo Von who has struggled with this low self-worth for decades and decades? Because most people are like, wait a second, I've been with my emotions for a long time. They're always plaguing me. Yeah, so can you talk about that?
There's a very big difference between consciously going towards and into your emotions and forever, my emotions have just been taking me over. Like, it's not the right relationship to have to your emotions. Most people who think they've been with their emotions have not been with their emotions. They've spent their whole life trying to run away from them. Mm-hmm. That's weird. That's like saying, you don't understand. I've spent my whole life with dogs. But really the whole time you've been like, oh no, there's another one. Shut the door. Oh my gosh, there's fur everywhere. We have this horribly adversarial relationship with our emotions. And yet we have the audacity to essentially say, I've been with them. No, people don't know how to be with emotions. That's the reality, because we're not taught that. Why? Because our parents weren't. If a little kid was upset and the parent sat down and said, I want to understand exactly what it is you're feeling right now. Oh, it makes sense that you were feeling that way. Why was that scary? If there was a kind of a working with emotion, we wouldn't develop the terror towards our own emotion. It's when our emotion is turned against that we learn how to react to our own emotion that way. And then we become stuck.
Yeah. So let's go to childhood, because I think you're probably the first person that reframed how I understand personality disorders, like narcissism, sociopathy, all those sorts of things. I used to see them as these random lightning strikes that would just take a person and, that's a narcissist. There's someone with a social personality disorder. And according to you, and something that I've come to believe, they actually come very predictably from certain childhood experiences and predictable responses to those childhood experiences. So let's talk about those. And then generally for somebody who maybe isn't a narcissist, what they might find in themselves from their childhood.
Okay, so which one do you want to start with? Because this is so broad.
Yes. Let's do the ones that are, I think, most interesting, which is the narcissist. Like, how do these people get made, or the codependent, for instance?
Okay, so the codependent and the narcissist is essentially generated out of the exact same childhood experience, which is a dysfunctional family. When we use the word dysfunctional, what we mean is that the way that the members of this family behave is a detriment to each other rather than a benefit to each other. So inherently, it's not something that is working for any member of that group, right? And by the way, it's very easy to walk into a dysfunctional family and see the whole family system kind of orbiting around like an alcoholic or something like that and be like, well, it's only working for them. No, it isn't. In a dysfunctional family dynamic, even if the whole family revolves around the needs of one being, it's still not working for that person either, right? So in a dysfunctional family dynamic, you've got these very classic roles. Doesn't matter whether you go in the world, you're going to see these same roles, right? You've got essentially the person who is in this narcissistic state, right? Already. They could be because of any number of different reasons. And that person is only thinking about themselves. They're literally stuck in it's all about me. So that person is going to look more on an overt way, like everything happens the way they want it to happen. Like everybody's just sort of kowtowing to whatever it is that they need. You know, it's like the whole family system is revolving around that one individual and their issues or their addiction or the way they need life to be, right? Then you've got the codependent. I'll explain how these are created in a minute, but then you've got the codependent, who is somebody who is all about themselves too, but it's not going to look like it on the surface. This person has created all kinds of strategies to get their needs met in manipulative ways. So they're just being narcissistic, backdoor, right? Now, when kids are born to this environment, they are not looked out for. Why? Because they've got two parents who are, again, they've just found all these different ways to be for themselves, whether it's overt tyranny or whether it's creating huge consequences or whether it's manipulating via needs or, the list is endless. So very quickly, the children who are born into this environment learn, I'm in trouble here, because just like being born into a shark pit or being born into the reptile kingdom, it's like, I don't actually have genuine advocacy here. It's pretty much every man for himself. And that's the emotional undertone of the entire family. That's the reality of what's going on, despite what you see on the surface, right? Because on the surface, we might see, ooh, the family's going for fun hunting trips together. Ooh, look, we all got matching t-shirts. But the underlying tone is, you got to find a way to fit in here very quickly to meet your needs because it's every man for himself. So what'll happen is you'll usually have a child in that situation that cannot reasonably find a way to fit in. They can't find a way to please the parents. And because they can't find a way to please the parents, they can't create what's called confluence in a relationship. To imagine confluence, you just think about two rivers, right? Confluence is when they join like this. Now, every person is looking for that sensation in a relationship. That feels like harmony. That feels like closeness. That feels like security. The child who is usually on the scapegoat spectrum, right, which is what we call them, comes into this family, can't find a way to create confluence with either parent for whatever reason. There's a lot of different reasons for that. And because of it, they learn, okay, well, if it's every man for himself, nobody's going to be here for me. I better start fighting. So this kid starts being like, all right, I'm not going to consider you guys. I'm going to consider me, and I'm going to start being about me. And now that becomes the next narcissist. So the way that narcissism, as we would label it, generates is when a person can find no reasonable way to create confluence and therefore starts to go entirely for their own needs in a zero-sum game against other people.
And then they get older and can find people who might be interested in finding confluence with them, but can't shake that pattern that is so deeply ingrained.
Well, I mean, they would find partners who continue this cycle. Like, they don't really look at what is underneath all of it, which is the failure to create trust in a relationship. That's really what breaks the entire cycle, is to have an experience of something that is the opposite of the zero-sum game. Of course, we're all locked in this mentality that like narcissism as a personality disorder rather than an adaptive strategy is something that people will never go out of. And it's not true. It's a protection mechanism. It's just that we tend to find our way into relationships that require the same protection mechanisms. This is part of what my whole job is about, right? Because if we create a way of protecting ourselves, we've like created this entire structure for the way we operate in the world that only makes sense in the context of that dysfunctional dynamic. If we take all of that into another, type of environment, it doesn't work. And so we actually start to feel insecurity. And so we start to feel like, oh, well, the only place that I can actually make sense, as a being is in that very dysfunctional dynamic. Okay, so the codependent, I got to go there too, because the codependent is the child who can figure out a way to create confluence with the parents. And so they are the ones who give up aspects of themselves in order to sneakily get their needs met. And they learn a pattern of chronic manipulation for the sake of their own needs. And it's very difficult for people to recognize. Why? Because at face value, they seem like the givers. This is the sweet kid. This is the real easy kid who's like, whatever you want, Mom. And so on the outside, we're going, that is the least self-centered child. Oh, no. They're just as narcissistic as the rest of the family members. It's just, they figured out, whatever you want, Mom, means extra candy, cuddles, whatever other need they have. But I mean, that person then, they usually find somebody with a very strong personality, another person who's usually on the narcissistic end of the spectrum, right? Because they're like, ooh, I know how to work with this. Oh my God, your favorite sport? That's funny. It's like my favorite too. Right? And then they create false confluence in their relationships, which turns into its own hell. And it's like this whole cycle of dysfunction repeats.
Got it. So those are extreme examples. I'm so fascinated by the subtle ones because I would say that myself and everyone I knew is on the narcissism or codependency spectrum, meaning like there's elements of their personalities that come through. And so how does that, because somebody might be listening to this and think, oh, thank God that's not me.
Oh, no.
How can they identify themselves in these more drastic examples that you just drew?
Okay, the first thing to understand is that we've got it backwards. Most people think that the majority of families are functional. And not even families, the majority of people, the majority of social structures are functional, and it's the rarity that is dysfunctional. It's actually the reverse. Humanity is really in the dark ages, especially in terms of relationship and how to interact with each other. And so it's the vast majority of families that are in fact dysfunctional. They all fall somewhere on the spectrum. And because, these things are not actually personality disorders, they're adaptive strategies. We all fall somewhere on the spectrum. Every one of us, like it's everybody watching this, you do, okay? There are strategies you use that are more like, you know what, I'm willing to play an over zero-sum game and only think about me. And there are parts of you that are like, oh, I want to really get my needs met. And so I'm going to basically find this way or that way or this way or that way to just sort of do it in a roundabout way rather than going straight for it. And nobody really is practicing conscious win-wins.
And so one of the things that it was very hard for me initially to identify myself in that because the words that you used were not ones I would like manipulative, sneaky, all those things. I was like, no, that's not me. And so I'm curious, can you give some examples of subtle ways? And you did mention one, for instance, when children are hurt or something and the parent can't come to them and say, share with me your experience. I want to hear it. There's emotional states that are accepted by the parents and there's other ones that are just buck up, get over it type of thing. So what might we have heard as kids that would be an indicator that, oh, you should look to this because that might be a place where you developed one of these strategies?
If it felt like your life was decided for you and you didn't really get a say in it, let's say that mom and dad are obsessed with a certain sport, or it could be just one parent is obsessed with a sport. They've decided you're going to play it. You really don't have an option. They seem to have a lot of investment in you turning into, a certain thing. There's not a lot of openness around you making your own decisions for what you're wanting in your life. That's one. Another one would be that you're like expected to meet the needs of the parents. We call this like an inverted dynamic where instead of the parents really being about the success of the kid, that's kind of a gaslight because the real expectation is like, I gave life to you. Now you need to give appreciation back, or you need to take care of us when we're older, or you need to, X, Y, or Z. I mean, there's going to be a lot of men, I think, that are even interested in waking up to these types of dynamics would have had dads that may have been more absent, maybe emotionally unavailable, were not really showing up for the women in their lives, and therefore moms leaned on the sons as surrogate partners. A lot of it always scares the crap out of me in my business when men come up to me and they're like, "Oh, my mom is my best friend."
Dead giveaway.
Yeah. Dead giveaway for what we call emotional incest.
Yeah. Yeah.
God, there's so many of these things. Leverage. So one of the other things is gifts that are given specifically with some kind of a string attached. I mean, really what you need to look at is, what was the motivation for my parent doing this thing that was painful for me? Now, what we have to be willing to do is to look at what was painful for me, right? And a lot of us, when we're protecting our families, we're not really going there. We're not really sitting down and saying, wait a minute, my parent did this when I was 5 years old. I have this very, very solid memory of it. Why did my parent do that? Now, and I mean with the intention of really trying to figure out why, not like coming up with an excuse that gets them off the hook. Why? Right? What were they trying to get by doing that?
Yeah. This is a tough one for people because I've seen this in myself and in others. There's often a family mythology because, something happens when you're 5 and then the explanation is given by the 2 adults in the room for why that thing happened. And that becomes the dominant worldview of how love is expressed. Oh, it didn't feel good, but that's what love is. Love doesn't always feel good in these ways that mom and dad say that it's not supposed to feel good because it was for me in that circumstance. And seeing that and talking to people who haven't quite been able to unwind that has been shocking to me, the depths to which we really, that's the definition of love. Our parents set that template in front of us, and breaking that is so painful because, like you said, when you let go of that, it's, oh, that hurt and it wasn't love, is such a painful recovery to do. Yeah,
it's super, super hard. But I mean, if we are dedicated to learning how to love as a species, we have no other option than to recognize what is and what is not love. And that includes in the people that we cherish.
So this takes us then to the win-win, to what is love. So I remember the first time and listening to some of this, you're like, well, listen, everything's kind of transactional. Everything is like, what is this broader third way that is not manipulating or dominating? How do you think about and help people to open up to a new way of relating to people?
Okay, the first thing that I really like to do is to have people separate the concept of love from the concept of energy exchange in a relationship. Ideally, every relationship would have elements of both, right? But we understand the idea of energy transaction because we do business with each other. Like, anybody who's in business understands energy exchange, but there's energy exchange in every relationship, period, the end. So love is really the one that kind of like pops in and out of being. This one is always there. So why is it important to separate those out? Because to love is to take something as a part of the self. When you've done that, you've now developed a connection to that thing where you can't harm it without harming yourself. Ironically, most men relate more to this when they think about the car that they love. If you're connected to the car, and something damaging happens to the car, you experience that as damage to yourself. Because of that deep level of taking the other thing as a part of the self, there is deep levels of consideration. There's deep levels of caretaking. There's positive ownership. It's, I would rather wipe this car with a diaper, and put it in a secure garage than, leave it on the street, and who cares if somebody keys it, and maybe I'll turn it in for insurance money. So that's what love looks like, right? Love inspires us to understand as much as we can about the object of our love so that we can then act in a way that is in the best interests of that thing that we love. Okay, set that aside, right? We have to set that aside now. Other side of this is, in every relationship, there is an energy exchange. So you may have this part over here towards, let's say, a woman. Over here, the major reason that may be compelling you towards this relationship with the woman is you provide some kind of, let's say, masculine containment. You may be protecting. You may be providing. Now, she may be offering some kind of, nurturing needs. She may be the person who's really there to listen to your emotions. She may be somebody for whom you're getting a lot of fun with, right? There may be some kind of sexual exchange. I mean, we could basically sit here all day long and be like, what is it that's being given, back and forth here? And I don't want people to think about this as straightforward as that too, because it is very possible that somebody gets from giving. That's a transaction that's often missed, where it's like, let's say, like I've met men who, like, let's say they sort of offer protection for a female. It's not like they actually need anything in return for that. It's the feeling of a woman accepting the protection that's like,
yeah.
So yeah.
So what you said that there's these exchanges. Is there a rule of thumb for what makes a healthy versus an unhealthy exchange of energy?
It's literally, does it benefit both people? Is it what they want? Is it what they need? Now, this is where we need to really start to question our like structures of right and wrong, right? Because there is such a thing as healing on the way to completely healed. And as humans, we tend to have a very rigid idea of what is healthy.